Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 45. So, as you sit and you look at all of your digital data, sometimes it just washes over you and you hope that somewhere out of it, inspiration will strike or a great idea, a lightning bolt of insight that guides you to a huge ROI. But here's the question. What if you could make your own weather, so to speak, setting up and knocking down hypotheses in a way that made you the cool kid in a analytics sense? Well, buckle up, because you're in Tornado Alley tonight. And my fellow storm chaser is none other than Tim Wilson.
Heidi-ho!
That's not really what a storm chaser says, Tim.
I know, but I was blanking on Helen, in Twister? What's her name?
Is it Helen Hunt?
Is it Helen Hunt?
Twister, 1996 movie starring Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton.
So am I Bill Paxton or am I Helen Hunt? You, dear listeners, can be the judge.
I haven't watched this movie since, I think, 1996. All right, and I'm Michael Helbling. All right, Tim. Well, setting up this topic, that's something that I think a lot of analysts and a lot of companies struggle to make this transition into effective analysis and insight generation because they don't understand how to take the data that they've got and transform it into hypotheses and how to prioritize them. So that's what we're going to spend time tonight. So let's start us off, Tim. How do you kind of help people do this, or what has worked for you in this?
So I think you hit the nail on the head that part of the challenge is I think there's this raging misconception in the marketplace. I mean, I think marketers and businesses definitely have this, and unfortunately, I think too many analysts have this as well, that somehow saying we have all this data, we have more data than we've ever had, we do need to just dive in, let it wash over us, and wait for insights to emerge. I feel like I've talked until I am blue in the face, and I've got 2 more times that I'm doing that basic pitch just this fall, because the fact is we do need to have hypotheses before we start doing analysis, in my view. So I think kind of step 1 is just trying to explain that to people. I use a Mythbusters analogy. I mean, that's seems to be a clear way to articulate to any group and say, what if Mythbusters was run like many marketing campaigns or like many channels are invested in? It literally would be Jamie and Adam standing in the workshop and saying, wow, we have a bunch of stuff. Hey, how about if we go blow up that car? And then they go blow up the car, and then they say, is that myth busted or confirmed? And they'd be like, well, wait a minute, I don't know. And, maybe one of them chimes in and says, well, we instrumented it. We know that explosion shot debris 22 feet up into the air, and they'd be like, great, but what's the actual myth we were trying to bust? And I think that, to me, that's an analogy I use a lot, is what happens is we do something and people are excited about it. And it started with some genesis of an idea of this is our strategy, or this is our objective, or this is how it aligns with the message we're trying to get out to the market. But then it's kind of, we did it, now give us the learnings. And there was no stopping up front and saying, how do we believe the world works? Like, why do we think this would work? What do we want to learn, right? We never hear about a campaign or an initiative being looked at as saying, yes, we want it to be successful in its own right, but what is it we want to get smarter about? And what do we want to get smarter about needs to start with, well, I think that mobile video ads will be a fantastic way for us to draw in millennials. And if we're right, we're going to double down on that and do more of it. But there just isn't that discussion. So I think step 1 is absolutely just getting people to separate the volume of data from, you still have to have questions and you have to have ideas. Our last episode, Dennis Mortensen, talking about AI, and he actually kind of said the same thing. So I'm like, yes, exactly. We're talking about AI. And he said, the successful people of the future are going to be the ones that are asking smart questions. We're going to get better at answering the questions, but the need to ask smart questions isn't going anywhere. So that's one thought.
Yeah.
But not that I have a strong position on that.
You're so rarely opinionated. It's very strange to suddenly encounter this. No, so I, of course, agree with you. A couple of things that I've observed and sort of lived through even in my own career is first and foremost sort of this concept of just sort of like, hey, look at all this data. And now we just watch the insights roll in. And in reality, as an analyst, a lot of times you're sitting there being like, well, where do I go? And then the other thing is sort of, and you kind of referenced this sort of almost spasmodic jerking, trying to find stuff because here we are in the middle of a storm and that's sort of just like a fight for survival, but there's no structure or finesse or bigger approach to how we're getting into the data and leveraging it so that it can you can build things. And so, and some of this is just really about like lack of planning, lack of thinking about what our objectives are, kind of writing down even what the things we want to learn about. Because it would be amazing to say, hey, we're going to go not only learn about social media and how to invest correctly there, but we have these other objectives that we want to use all of our social media spend to learn about. And so how do we construct our campaigns and our exposure in a way that helps us gain this kind of information? So that kind of thinking. The other thing is, and this is sort of backing up a little bit before we start into analysis, and that is defining some sort of framework that analysis or hypotheses can hang on. In other words, and we'll get into this a little bit in terms of hypothesis construction, but in essence, giving you some sort of hey, what is it that we're out here on the website to do, sort of what would be a good set of goals? And obviously that takes a lot of organizational support and buy-in, but in a lot of cases, they're sort of pretty straightforward, at least at a high level for, most businesses. And, obviously some really large businesses have multiple different things the site is there to do, but you can get down to kind of a core distillation of, hey, we sell things on our website. So people buying those things, that's really kind of core to this what's website experience. Or we're a B2B and we need to get our salespeople in touch with the right contacts at other companies. So how do we generate leads or incorporate data into our CRM system? That's how we measure that. Or, we are a brand that is trying to get information out to a broader set of public through the website, through coupons and things like that for CPG. So how do we measure and how do we have a framework for success around, how people are engaging our content, downloading our coupons, whatever the case may be.
For those of our listeners who are not in the U.S., also FMCG.
Oh, right. Oh, you and I'm traveling through Europe, so I've got to use... No, it's fine. And I do appreciate that because I don't know what that meant, but basically consumer goods.
FMCG, fast moving consumer goods.
Is that really what it's called?
Yeah. I think one of the enemies of hypothesis generation and meaningful analysis is sort of the rut that we get in day-to-day operations. Because I'm thinking about one of my clients has large e-commerce site and they had somebody new start, and he is kind of over in kind of the paid search and affiliate world. And kind of as the new guy, he just kind of said, we're spending all this money, and there's evidence that it's working. I mean, they can point to this is a good investment of money, but he was coming in with sort of a fresh set of eyes. And as he's learning the business, he's asking some of those basic questions of, what is our approach? Why is this our approach? And he's not asking it because he's saying it's wrong. He's saying, I'm trying to understand. But just in having that discussion, which there would be no reason for anybody to ask that question who has been, there at the company. There's just no need to say, you know what, time out. Let's just take a step back and say, what the hell are we doing and why are we doing it this way? Well, it turns out because we're making some assumptions. Brent Dykes had one of his articles within the last few months was on this whole idea of assumptions governance, and which I thought was, he didn't originate the idea. If you search for assumption governance, you'll find, other writing about it, but we don't really think about that as saying, have we stopped and thought about the things that we're doing that either take us a lot of time or cost us a lot of money are often based on assumptions. And I think Brent even made the point in his article that you have to operate on assumptions. You can't go and validate everything with the data, but we don't even stop and think about what are our assumptions. We're spending on display because we have, like, you watch this sort of insidious migration from carving off some TV spend to spend on digital, and that became display. And then we've been doing it and we've been looking at the data, but we've never kind of taken a real analytical approach to what are the assumptions into why we're doing this. Because articulating an assumption to me is you're halfway to articulating a hypothesis, if not farther. And I think analysts should play that role. Like when I use my sort of framework, a hypothesis is nothing more than saying, I believe fill in the blank. It's a tentative assumption you're making about the world. And that's all it takes to state a hypothesis. But the thing is we don't want to just go validate hypotheses that aren't going to lead to a decision. So we've got this second fill in the blank of, if we're right, then this is what we'll do. And I use that now all the time. Even if somebody's just like, go analyze the website, and I'm not going to be able to have the discussion I'd like to have, I've been around the block a few times. I will sit down, I will poke around the website, and I will generate hypotheses. And I ideally, and probably 75% of the time, I take those and basically sort of clean them up in that framework and say, okay, I think this might be going on. And if that's the case, then this is what we'll do. And I think this might be going on. And that can spark the discussion. So I know I jumped right into kind of the, my framework for doing that. But that all comes before. You said something earlier about, diving into the data. And I think it is so easy to become horrendously inefficient and ineffective by diving into the data prematurely and not spending some time doing, honestly, kind of the harder, more organic work of just thinking about what are those assumptions and what are those hypotheses and what might you do, depending on how they panned out.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I don't think that was the direction we were headed anyway, is sort of, if this, then what do we do about it? And, some of those core things about how we operate the business, obviously that guides, well, what is the action should our whatever we're researching come true? And so, no, I think that's appropriate.
And it's fine to me. That's the other thing, is there's another big misperception, is that every analysis is supposed to yield an actionable insight, which I think is a horribly unrealistic expectation. If I have an assumption, chances are 80% of the time that assumption is correct. So there's still value in me saying that assumption is based on this hypothesis, and I'm going to go validate it. And you know what? That assumption is largely true. Two things will happen from that. One, I can kind of move on and move on to other assumptions and don't have that uncertainty. Chances are, as I've been digging in to validate the hypothesis underlying that assumption, other things will crop up. And I will say, oh, you know what? But I just generated 3 or 4 more hypotheses. I'm not necessarily going to run them all to ground. I'm going to put them in that same world where I want to sit down, float those out to people. And that kind of happens. I love when that happens, that you're saying, you know what, your assumption is effectively true, but we noticed this other weird thing about your paid search traffic. Does this make sense to you? It seems kind of odd to me, and it's not what we were trying to chase down. But if this is true, let's talk about what that would mean, because I can go and validate whether that really is the case. But let's talk about what you do if that is the case.
Right.
So actually validating hypotheses that don't lead to action is okay, and it's probably going to happen more often than not, because you have to. Like, if every analysis you're doing is turning up some horrendous surprise, it's like, well, somebody needs to be smacked upside the head about, how consumers behave, because you're not going to find a million golden nuggets, when you turn over a million stones.
Yeah. And I think sometimes there is a lack of patience in organizations for analytics to kind of do its work, because we think, oh, well, every time you turn over one of those stones, you got to be coming up with big incremental gains. And sometimes we just learn something fascinating that we sock away, and it doesn't have an application for maybe years, and that's something I think if you're somebody who's managing an analytics team, I think that skill of like how to direct analysis and how to know when to kind of position, like, okay, I think we're headed the right direction, or, we need to probably go this way or that way. Like, it's a skill that very, very few people really do well. And sometimes as an analyst, even when you're not directed, you don't know exactly when to sort of be like cut bait and move to another topic. And sometimes as analysts, we get real razor focused on something we find pretty interesting, but our time could be better. And that prioritization, I think, is also kind of a really big deal of like, how do we kind of make sure, well, how do we derive the most value? Because again, some of this is very scientific, but there's also an art to picking. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I remember, how there's always an article every so often about how analytics is ruining creative. And in a certain sense, if you think about it, like the demand for results is ruining analytics is something that some people probably never said that way, but it's probably a feeling they have of like, let me do the analysis I want to do because it's interesting. And I think it might have something meaningful but I don't want to. So again, it's like this balancing act of, how do we kind of serve the overall goals of the company while at the same time having enough leeway to do research or do analysis around hypotheses that may or may not yield like incredible dollar signs? Does that make sense? Yeah.
I mean, I am a fan of trying to discreetly articulate every hypothesis. And I try to me, this seems like it's a unnecessarily challenging leap for some people to make, that there's not a one-to-one relationship of hypothesis to analysis to presented results. I may do one analysis that may actually have 2 or 3 or 5 hypotheses in it that may be 1 or 2 or 3 deliverables, but I do try as hard as I possibly can to bucket out each hypothesis. And I'm fine with the little small hypotheses and kind of the idea of sub-hypotheses sort of as well, because I think there's sort of a twofold value. One, you can start to show people, look, we started with legitimate hypotheses and 60% or 80% didn't turn anything up. So let's start kind of managing expectations as to, how much we have to invest. Now we can also point to say, now these hypotheses, we just validated them or we weren't able, it was non-conclusive. But what we did figure out? We figured out we had this other data, or we built a foundation to do these future analyses, or we generated these other hypotheses. So it doesn't mean there's zero value, but we can start to pivot the group. Don't just tell me to go dig into your email data and find insights. We've got to break it down into these discrete things. And I feel like analysts just don't click that. We're such pleasers that we want to have one conversation and then just go and do a ton of analysis. And to me, it's like, it's not that hard. Everybody likes to talk about their business. Users love to talk about what they're doing and why they're doing it. So if I dive into analysis and say, you know what, I found some stuff, I'm getting to a certain level, I don't think there's anything super surprising here. I'm basically validating the hypotheses, but I'm not going to polish up this final deliverable. I want to go back and meet with the stakeholder, and I'm going to walk her through the current state of the deliverable and see if it sparks some other hypotheses, sparks some other investigation points. They know the business better than I do, and I'm not trying to deliver kind of the big aha in one big final reveal. So I don't know if that was actually responding to your
no,
your
but
pod.
I mean, the nice thing is we trip merrily along. We stub our toe on all of our little bugaboos or bugbears, as Simon Rumble taught us a couple episodes ago.
Bugbears.
I'm starting to adopt that. So no, you're right, and actually, that process of integration is one that is really difficult, both externally and internally. And, this is where soft skills and analytics, I think, are so critical and probably undervalued, in that you have to be friends with people and get their buy-in and their trust, so they show you and are honest with you about what it is they're trying to do and give you feedback, and so that you can show them, here's some stuff that I've started to put together. It's still kind of molten and it hasn't taken shape, because that's the challenge. And certainly, you and I, Tim, both now live on the consulting side of the world, where the typical model is, we've got all this brain power. We'll ask you some deep probing questions. We'll walk away for 3 weeks and then return with a magnificent statue that is now, and so, and in reality, the best thing to probably do is say, great conversation. We're going to dig for a week, and then we're going to come back with all kinds of dirty guts and fish, and we're going to look at it all together, and it's going to be smelly, and put your boots on. And then we're going to go back, and eventually we're going to get to some really great things, but we're going to do this process together.
Yeah.
And I think there's such a lack of understanding or willingness of that process of, okay, yeah, that's great, but that's going to take way too long to prove out. Or, hey, we could do something with that right now. Let's put that closer to the top of the list, because I think there's real value in what we could learn there. Or, okay, see, we studied that 4 times last year, and basically we kind of know that inside and out. You didn't know that, so let's chuck that out the window. So before you then made that the centerpiece of your massive dog and pony show at the end, right? Which I've seen that kind of thing happen tons of times. So again, it's that back and forth. It's the combination of the analytics expertise and the domain expertise, or the business expertise. And it's that collaboration that is so vital. And that's why it's important that your leadership or your sponsor or whoever it is that's enabling this, if it's marketing, the CMO or the director or whoever's in charge of what you're doing, believes in, trusts, and understands, okay, here's how we integrate in what we're going to be doing. And we've got buy-in from the organization.
That is kind of reminds me of another challenge in this area is when you're the sole analyst or a small team and you're reporting up to somebody who maybe has misperceptions. I've watched that, and it's actually easier for a consultant, because usually they're like, hey, we're paying you. So if I say, look, dude, it doesn't work that way. If you're saying that in this really murky world, you want somebody to come in and just magically put together all the pieces of your entire cross-channel strategy and present glorious insights, when they're external or they're brand new, like you're smoking crack. Like, it's not going to happen. But I have, even as an external person, and I've just gotten more comfortable. This probably comes more with, age than anything else, that saying, no, like, we need to, either we're all going to sit down and look at this messy data, put on your hip waders, because it's going to get not deep and bullshit. Just, there's a lot of stuff to wade into. I still will do everything I can to make it understandable. Like, this is not like, oh, here's a massive spreadsheet.
Yeah, definitely. But
yeah, let's sit collectively with this pivot table and slice it a few ways, or let's look at it these 2 or 3 ways. And I'm not going to pull you in for a half day. I'm not asking you to go through all of this. I just have generated questions of saying, well, this seemed surprising to me. Can we explain that? I can't explain that. Can you explain that? Asking the subject matter expert, can they explain something that looks odd to me, the analyst, is about 12,000 times more efficient than saying, I'm going to sit here and just dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the data when somebody may be able to look at it and totally explain it.
Right. And that's the application of context.
Right.
And that's so vital because as an analyst, you might actually come up with the answer that is that piece of context through your analysis and a lot of travail and hard work. But then the person is like, why did you spend so long trying to figure that out? We know this because this is how our business works. You're like, well, yeah, now I know. But, you could have just asked.
But I found a really expensive way to get to something that you already knew.
Yeah. Something that we just take for granted around here or we understand as sort of fundamental. And so, that is a big organizations, that's a big hurdle. And you're right. Like if you get hired into an organization, you're kind of the junior person and you're in a structure that is, I don't know what advice to give at that moment, except to try to push people towards this kind of a construct and things like that. But it is difficult, I think, when there's not sort of a mutual understanding coming from the other side.
Yeah. And I think that's when, if there's a manager saying, no, you can't go back and talk to that person again until you've got the final result. Like that's the killer. But I would say, I mean, this will get into organizational stuff. Anytime any manager is saying you can't go talk to a stakeholder.
Right.
I think at a fairly low level, you can say, look, I legitimately have 3 or 4 things that all look kind of interesting. But the last thing I want to do is present to 12 people with something where they're going to say, yeah, we already knew that. If I just go talk to this one person and say, help me understand your business more. Cause that's that other weird thing that we feel like, oh, we're asking people to explain their business and they know how their business works. I'm wasting their time. It's like, no, turns out hopefully they're doing their job because they like it and they are thrilled to have somebody who's, asking them explain more. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? I mean, I'm envious on that front of analysts who are internal because when I was internal, I got to build all that stuff up and I had the handful of people who I knew were so fun to work with and I'd learned from them about the business and we could just have so much fun on different projects because they were asking smart questions. And there were the other people who maybe it was a little rocky at first, but I could kind of help sort of guide them and we got to where we were working together well. And that, that takes full-time internal listening to things over, cubicle walls and even listening in casual conversations. I mean, I think that's another skill to learn. I think that construct of, I believe if we're right, we will. That's not something to say, I'm going to put a Google form up and I'm going to just send all my business users to fill that into. It is something that an analyst can totally work with that and say, I just had a great conversation and they seem so full of ideas and I jotted notes down. Well, let me go look at my notes. And now let me see if I can take this random 3 pages of notes and if I can translate that into hypotheses, that's kind of like active listening of a pretty high order because that's going to take what them just kind of, barfing thoughts and questions and ideas and saying, I'm going to do the work of putting that into a hypothesis that points to an action that I can play back to them. And they're not going to have a problem with it. They're going to like it. They're going to read it and say, oh shit. Yeah. I told you all that. And oh, by the way, that's not really what I meant. You kind of misinterpreted that. That's not a fail. That's why you do it because to make sure that you're clear.
Yeah. Deeper understanding and then alignment on what to go after. So we touched on a little bit around sort of prioritization, right? And so low effort, high impact. How do you construct this for people, or how do you kind of guide people through what to go after and when?
Oh, I have a 2x2 matrix, and along the x-axis is the level of effort, and the y-axis is high impact. I've seen that fucking 2x2 matrix at so many conferences. A/B testing gurus love that, which I just think is
that CRO gurus?
CRO gurus, yeah.
That's one of my bugbears.
I love that. They're like, oh yeah, just find the tests that are going to be low effort and that are going to generate high impact. And I'm like, well, okay, if I knew what was going to generate high impact, then why am I doing the test? And we're living in the real world, not in kind of a theoretical, oversimplified, construct. So the reality is if you plot every one of those with your best guess at what kind of impact might it have and your best estimate of how much effort it's going to be, guess how many you have that are low effort and high impact, like 1.
Yeah, or 2 or something like that.
That's not the quadrant things live in. So I think it's a lot greater than that. And, whether it's done sort of organically, the reality is, you've got the highest paid person's opinion. And I think we talked about doing it in defense of the hippo, or has that been a blog post? I know I've heard the in defense of the hippo. The highest paid person's opinion should not be immediately discounted. Like
the hippo comes in and out of style depending on who you talk to.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, like in like Kevin Hillstrom speak, right? That's the person who's going to get fired if this is all wrong.
Right.
So,
and it's the person who's most likely to be able to drive action. They have budget, they have people, and their ass is on the line. So the fact is, I had a client, and she was amazing. It was a little short engagement. She was the CMO of this organization, and sat down with her, and she mapped out, she was an analyst's dream because she had mapped out she would sketch it, and she had clearly drawn this thing so many times of this is how our business works, and this is how our marketing works within the business. And what I need to be able to do is confirm this, and specifically this arrow here, I'm the most uncertain about, and this arrow here, I'm the most uncertain about. And I went back to the analyst saying, oh my God, like she is like one of the best CMOs you could ever have because she has an analytical mind and she's asking smart questions. Now you may also have CMOs who say, you got all that data, you got that fancy web analytics platform, go give me some insights, tell me the answers. And that's a problem because they haven't asked a question. So, but definitely the higher you up on the food chain, the more attention you're going to get. So that's one. I think that second part of the, if we are right, we will do X, the more crystallized that is, the more it is, if this is what the hypothesis, the validation turns up, then we'll do action A. And if this is what it is, it will be B. And because of the way we're going to approach this, it's going to be pretty crystal clear. I think that bubbles up in the priority because it's more likely to lead to action if it's something where it's clear what the action should be. So, I mean, trying to do ones that are going to prove somebody wrong, like to me, that's a huge red flag. If you're like, John Smith has bugged me for years and he's been going around saying Instagram is the be all end all and I'm going to show him, we're going to make him look like an idiot. It's like, be careful.
Right.
Analysts can't really make even if you're saying you're objective and the data is what it is, making anybody look just black and white bad is not ideal. I mean, that may be the right analysis to do, but you need to figure out a way to do it where you don't want anybody to lose. You want them to be the ones championing that, hey, I've been championing this, but it turned out I worked with Tim to do the analysis, and I'm thinking we should change to X or Y.
My overused buzzword in this area is alignment. It is along the lines of what you just described, which is, hey, CMO or the VP of marketing, they care about these 5 things. Guess what's really high on our list of things to hypothesize about? Obviously, it's going to be the things that they're really betting on. And that makes a lot of sense. And also what you just said about the politics of data and how organizations can, and that's very damaging, frankly, to analytics and probably to the organization itself. And when you see that, that is a red flag when somebody's going after somebody else with data because they want to prove them wrong. And actually, hypothesis and testing kind of fall to this a lot, I think, in different organizations when you get 2 different sides basically using it as a cudgel against each other. I just use the word cudgel.
Sometimes a cudgel can really help drive some alignment.
Drive some alignment with the cudgel.
You get those 2 people in a room and smack them with a cudgel. You box their ears is what you do.
2 marketers enter, 1 marketer leave. No, but the reality is that there's a common enemy, right, of every organization, which is, I don't know, entropy, failure, competitors taking away all your customers, and getting together and viewing the common enemy then gives you a framework for doing all the analysis and getting the insights and hypotheses that you need. And using it that way is way more virtuous in terms of the pursuit of analysis than, say, like going after somebody kind of cross-departmentally or something like that. And no matter how you feel about social media or something else new that just came up, right? And it's hard because you see people chasing sort of, I don't know, I kind of call it shiny object syndrome, right? Where it's, hey, Snapchat's really popular. You can advertise on Snapchat. Maybe we should make Snapchat filters for all of our retail locations so people can take pictures with like our logo on there, and that'll be big brand reach to millennials. And that's probably a strategy and a discussion that is happening on the regular right now. And that's okay, because that might not be wrong, but like, let's figure out how where does that serve us, or how does that help us, and all those things. And I might have just gone way off on sidetrack.
Well, no, that has me thinking. I mean, that actually reminds me of, I hate to use the whole, so I've got a client but the client kind of in a tricky space, not kind of a hard online conversion, social media manager who kind of hear from the analyst like, oh, she's difficult. She just has a million questions and she just wants this and that. And she's maybe a mildly challenging personality, but you know what she's really passionate about? Social media. You know what she's done a ton of reading about? Social media. Turns out, you know what she has? A lot of smart thinking about social media. And she doesn't know how to use the data. She may have woeful misperceptions about how the data works. But for multiple years now, every time I have a conversation with her, it's fun because I'm listening for saying, you're trying to explain to me how social media works. And it turns out you're kind of right. I can explain to you what the data can or can't tell you, but now we're going to jointly decide what's the right way to validate this hypothesis. And I watch the analysts get frustrated with her because sometimes the stuff that she's looking for requires some weird, data pulls that are kind of challenging to go figure out where to get it. But if you think about the data, it should be there. Like, it's a legitimate hypothesis where she has already articulated a strong action. Why are you frustrated? Because it's hard. Give these people, they may be challenging personalities. They may be in an area that's social media. You may not like social media personally, but man, you need to work with them and say, we're trying to do what's right for the organization and let me help you. And gee, if they're on board and they have a hypothesis that you think is the dumbest thing, there's no way it's going to pan out, embrace that and do it really, really well and say, I'm going to validate it anyway or fail to validate it and take them right along with me, because now we've worked on this together and it's not, I was right, you were wrong. It's, we agreed that this was a legitimate question and we partnered to answer it. And now we can turn to the rest of the organization and say, we partnered and did X. And oh, by the way we did this was by working together to be really clear about what we thought was happening, what our assumptions were, what the hypothesis was, and then we validated it because we knew we could take this action. And you know what? We're going to shut off paid media on Facebook, for instance. So yeah, no, Tim, I think this is a really good discussion. And it's sort of an underserved area of analytics, in my view, generally, in that I don't think people give attention and intentionality to this aspect. They definitely spend a lot of time focused on the tools, like let's get the right tools. Let's do a ton of analysis to figure out what the right tool is for us. We spend a lot of time thinking about what it is we're going to measure and how we're going to get that data, right? So how do we build our data storage? How do we integrate our data together? This is all good stuff, but then we just fall right off a cliff in terms of our intentionality when it comes time to start using that data to actually do something.
and that's where turns into a swamp and not a river, right? Or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I've got theories about why that is, because, there's a hard dollar cost on the technology, and there are a lot of vendors, and I'll say all technology vendors, out over promising that, get our, for instance, you could see, you could bring in the weather data put it right next to your traffic data, and I can list multiple vendors that talk about, being able to do that. And then just think, you'd be able to see if you were selling bicycles, you would be able to see. I'm like, well, yeah, but I'm selling toilet paper, and people shit as much when it's raining as when it's cold as when it's hot.
Is that your hypothesis? Because, we could research that.
We could.
I'm sorry. You like to pick on this weather data example because I've heard you do that before, but in reality, there's a couple of scenarios if you can do real-time segmentation because of certain specific weather data, that would be a good thing to do.
No, absolutely.
Oh, okay. Just want to make that clear.
But look at what the vendors can do is they can say across our entire install base, we've generated 5 highly impactful case studies in 5 totally different industries that are these 5 little snowflake oddball things, and we can tell those stories. But today I had a vendor contact me about one of my clients because I know the vendor, and he's like, hey, the client's blowing me off, and I'd really like to get this moving. I'm like, I know you would, because you'd like to hit your quota, but this has no value whatsoever for the client. But you're telling everybody you can, buy our technology, you'll be able to do these amazing things. I'm like, yeah, but not without a common key. Oh, you're going to integrate with your offline data. Well, not in your CPG/FMCG. You're not getting the purchase. So shut the hell up. That's a load of crap. So I think that's part of it is there. And then the time lag, right? You've got the sales process where they're saying, all you got to do is get our stuff installed. It's going to take 2 weeks, and then you'll have glorious insights. Well, it takes 3 months to negotiate the contract. It takes 9 months to get it implemented. The whole time you're just hanging on to what the sales guy said, which was, and the glorious insights will emerge. You finally get it rolling, and people are exhausted. So they're saying, oh my God, we now have all this data, and we're just going to jump into the swamp, instead of saying, holy crap, I don't have a process. I still need to have rigor. I still need to have the same diligence I had when I had my lesser, crappier, free, poorly implemented tool, that I had then. That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And I will say the other side is I think that the business as well as analysts will completely confuse the looking at the past and measuring performance. KPIs are only relevant in hypothesis validation and from your alignment perspective. What is it what do we care about at the end of the day? But when you're using KPIs, you're just measuring, are we hitting our goals? Like, are we achieving what we expect to achieve with our plan? We're generating hypotheses to help us do that, but they're kind of a separate thing. The hypotheses are, let's make an assumption about what's going on because we want to change the action in the future. And yes, if we do this well, we will continue to meet our performance objectives. But that too happens with the give me the campaign report, and I want my actionable insights from the campaign report. It's like, well, if you're delivering one campaign report, part of that should be, did the campaign deliver what it was supposed to? And the other part is, what were the hypotheses that we had that we were validating through the data from that campaign that is going to influence what we're going to do in the future? Because just saying that campaign fell below target, that doesn't tell me what I should do. But that's
right.
That's all the KPI does. It says, nope, you didn't do what you were expecting to do.
The KPI just tells you where to start asking questions.
Where you need to, because if you exceeded it, it doesn't mean that you couldn't exceed it farther. But the fact is, you laid out, these were the things that we wanted to do. And the ones where we missed it are the ones where you better start trying to figure out why, and so that you don't do that again.
Right. How do we fix what's broken, and how do we make big bigger?
Yeah. And your hypothesis may be, you know what, we just were ridiculously unrealistic about that, and we don't think we're ever going to hit it, and so we will never set that target again, which is still fine because that means that's influencing your future investment. If you say, yeah, we are not going to have 10% of the people who come to the site share it socially. Like that will never happen. So the next time when we're looking at that next campaign, let's be realistic about what we might do. And then we may say, maybe we don't want to do that campaign. That tactic doesn't make so much sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm glad we picked a topic that both you and I have so little interest or passion about. But actually, I mean, it makes a good segue because unfortunately we do have to wrap up. But, as you're listening, if you're a marketer, well, first, how did you end up here with all of us cool data nerds? And second, start taking an analyst with you everywhere in your business. Take them to all your meetings. Let them see what's going on. Let them hear the questions that are being asked so they can learn how to do analysis that brings back real value to you. And if you're an analyst, start trying to horn your way into all the meetings.
But I will say, if you can't just drag the analyst along. Like if you drag the analyst along, and maybe they're not asking questions in the meeting, but man, you better hope they're grabbing you afterwards. So maybe this is more to the analyst as well, because I watch analysts sometimes come into meetings and say, yeah, and I'm like, how? You don't know the business that well. There's no way this is 100% making sense to you. And again, I feel like I've played hey, I'm just the dumb analyst who doesn't understand the business. Let me ask the stupid questions.
Yeah.
And I swear people are like, oh my God, that's a great question. Or I hadn't really thought about it that way. And oh, by the way, I'm now more equipped to do the analysis because I asked a question that was a legitimate question. So analysts, you got to actually actively listen and process and say, does this make sense? Or do I need to probe more?
Well, and there's a certain amount, I always say there's a certain amount of humility required to be a good analyst, because to ask a good question or to formulate a good hypothesis means putting yourself in a position of not necessarily knowing the answers to everything. And so we're lucky, Tim, right? Because we can raise our hand and be like, well, I have an industry reputation, so I can ask a dumb question and people will give me the benefit of the doubt. I'd be like, oh, that's interesting because, we're not unproven in that context, but maybe someone else might feel that way. So it does, I feel the tension of that for people as they do feel pressure of like, I can't look dumb in front of this room and ask this question. Yeah,
but they got to get over that because that is a internal misperception. Like that is
possibly.
I think it absolutely is. I mean, I think that is, we tell ourselves that story that, oh, if I ask that, I'm going to look dumb, and I will 95 times out of 100 if you ask the question because you sat there and thought about it and said, I don't quite understand, or even, man, you're throwing buzzwords around and I don't get those buzzwords. And the fact is, and you can hedge it. The humility is a good way to put it. Say, look, I know this may be a dumb question. Everybody else seems to understand this. I mean, you got to be careful to not be like a snarky, like, I know this may be a dumb question, but really I think it's a smart question. I've done that. Yes, there are some people who know of me or know of my organization, but I am much, much more often working with people who've never heard of me. Like, I feel like I'm starting from...
Oh, it's the first thing I tell people. Like, I'm kind of a big deal here, guys.
I have a podcast. I had a blog and now I have a podcast.
That's right. It's hard to let that one slip out naturally. We just talked about this on my podcast. Well, you have a podcast? Oh yeah. How'd you know?
Yeah. Who told you? You must realize that. No, but I think that's a personality trait of an analyst, that we want to be right. We're not naturally comfortable saying, I don't know. But it's not that hard. I have a hard time looking back in my career when I wasn't, of all the things, I am racked with insecurities, not about this one topic apparently, but my entire career, I'm like, please explain that more. And it's like you do it twice and realize that, oh my God, not only are people not looking at me like I'm dumb, they're like so excited that somebody wants to hear it, and they'll find more time. They'll show up late for the next meeting so they can draw it out for me. And now I am so much better equipped. I mean, that is just to get over yourself. I mean,
I guess what I would caveat that with is if you're in an organization where people are actively trying to destroy each other with data, then probably don't ask the questions. But other than that, I'm totally in agreement with you, Tim. All right. We've got to transition to the part of the show where we do our last call. Something we find interesting, something that's going on in the world today, something we've come across. Tim, what's yours?
So last episode, I plugged a specific podcast episode. This time, I'm going to plug, and it actually ties in well to this episode. I'm going to plug an entire podcast. It's relatively new, although it's sort of transitioned from a different format. It's called Science Versus.
Oh my gosh. I was sitting here. I have not heard of that, so I'm very interested. However, my last call is also podcast related. So I think we're getting a little too insular here, Tim. We're in this podcast world now. We're just, all our friends are podcasters. No, sorry.
Well, I am a huge Gimlet Media fan, and I've run into other people who are, and it's one of theirs. So Science Versus, the premise is this Wendy, and I'm going to butcher, it's like Zuckerman, but I want to say on one of the first episodes, her boss actually on the recording was like, I'm mispronouncing your last name. And she said, yes, you are. And she pronounced it correctly. And now it's based on what it is. She's Australian. But Science Versus, they'll take on attachment parenting or fracking or gun control. And they dig in and say, okay, it's a polarizing issue. Let's dig into the facts. So I sort of throw it out to our listeners because it is one of those where, go figure, on all of these polarizing issues, it's actually not black and white. Nobody is 100% right or wrong. And it's kind of interesting. I would actually say she's not the most awesome journalist in the few episodes that I've listened to so far. She gets there, just maybe it's the production and the editing, and it's tough. The glass houses, I guess. But it's kind of interesting because to me, it kind of resonates with analytics where people want to have give me the answer. And it's like, well, it's kind of this, it's kind of that. It's not totally definitive. There's sort of things on both sides. So that's mine. What's your podcast related last call?
So I was recently introduced to a podcast that I kind of had heard of before. It's called Invisibilia.
Oh, yeah. Well, now it's got Hannah Rosen on it. She's like the new, yeah.
So Tim obviously is aware. So
big fan.
So yeah, it was recommended to me by colleague Stuart Schilling. So he's pretty smart. So I've given a listen. And specifically, there's an episode they did on June 17th called "The New Norm," about how sort of normative behaviors and things like that kind of define, what we do and all those kinds of things. So really interesting. I'm really enjoying it. There's so much of what analytics people do that is in this part of science in terms of how to influence and change people's opinions and understand the forces that are working under the surface in terms of how decision making is happening and things like that. So,
and that's the genesis of the Invisibilia. It's like the invisible forces that are shaping the world that we live in.
I should have probably started with that, but that's exactly right. So anyways, I'm really enjoying it. So I think it's, if you're in for another podcast, definitely one to add to your Stitcher. All right. Well, if you have been listening and you have been crying out in the car like, yes, or no, or whatever, give us a shout on Slack, on the Measure Slack, or on Twitter, or on our Facebook page. We want to hear from you. This is obviously a topic Tim and I both share a great deal of passion about. So if you found a great way to use hypotheses and you found ways to incorporate ideas into your organization effectively, what a great conversation to share with your colleagues and peers on social media. So love to hear from you as you're working, as you're thinking about it. Keep digging for those insights. And for my co-host, Tim Wilson, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. facebook.com/Analytics Hour or at Analytics Hour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Yeah, I just saw start recording too, Tim. All right. Oh, yeah. Wow, classing it up tonight.
Got to get rid of them.
Yeah, no, I feel ya. It's low calorie.
It's my special diet. Drink low calorie swill.
Can your last name be Winslow?
Sure.
All right.
Whatever you want.
Fascinating. Rubber baby buggy bumpers.
Always here to throw you off your game.
See, I figured that was those little smart cars. They're just little fast moving. You could like just chomp. Let's take all that. I'm taking it all back. Tuck myself right into a hole. Let's keep that.
Let's hand it off to Charlie from the social side. Well, we've been using Facebook Canvas, and I know that every number that we keep showing you shows that it's not working for shit. And, Facebook Canvas is limited to mobile. And, oh, by the way, the coupon process on mobile for this site is
completely broken.
Complete shit and horrible. So we're driving some registrations at a higher cost per registration, and we know these people probably aren't getting the coupon because they actually have to get to a desktop computer in order to download it.
Advertising on their mobile devices. Oh my gosh. Should we probably should not tell the story about our own Facebook. Well, and after our little debacle with Facebook.
Oh yeah, that was fan-fucking-tastic. Oh my God.
It's just incredible.
It's like, if you're a small business, I hope you do an experiment and spend $20 and then say, don't convince yourself that these random-ass people actually give two shits about your plumbing service. Oh my God.
No, ours was crazy successful. I mean, basically for $1 a like, we can have as many likers as we want. We were targeting people who lived in the United States, age 18 to 65, both genders, with detailed targeting who match at least one of the following: interests in technology, web analytics, entrepreneurship, marketing, and digital marketing.
Technology might have been the killer.
Well, or entrepreneurship, or just marketing. So I might have gone
a little broad.
Yeah, I might. Oh, and 95% of our likes came from mobile.
I mean, it's clearly not working. So are we going to double down and run it for another 6 months?
This is the stupidest. Oh man, I'm so glad that was on tape. That's the best thing I've ever heard.
Rock, flag, and hypotheses.